Greetings, everyone. Greetings to all of you from the heart of London. It is just fantastic to have you all here in person and online to discuss one of the greatest threats to humanity, climate change. But if I may, I would like to thank everybody out there who has been supporting the Iranian people, the women, and especially the young people who have been fighting for their basic rights of freedom and dignity. As an Iranian, and on behalf of all Iranians, I would like to say thank you. And this is a thanks from all of us Iranians, Iran and outside of Iran, for the love and the support that we have been given and getting from all of you around the world. Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. Women, life, freedom. Thank you. And now let us deal with one of the most serious threats facing humanity in the 21st century. Our planet is on a brink of irreversible changes to its life support systems. And this is something that we have been told by the scientists for decades. From record-breaking heat waves in Europe to unprecedented drought in California and the catastrophic floods in Pakistan. Carbon emissions this year were 1% higher than it was in 2021, and now is at the highest level ever. At the same time, the world leaders are at COP27 discussing how to reduce this down to net zero. Today, we are gathered here to talk about how we can tackle this emergency given the mountain we must climb. Our noted scientists, civil society activists, and decision makers are here today to share with us how the UK could do more to help save our precious planet by recognizing our global responsibility, as well as acknowledging the most vulnerable communities around the world and supporting their rights to international loss and damage funds. We will also be discussing how the UK can stay on track with the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement pathway given the Ukrainian invasion, and also what local communities can do in the light of the climate emergency. We have a short message from Mary Robinson, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and 7th President of Ireland.
Of the Climate Reality Project founded by Al Gore. So I'm happy to address Climate Reality Europe at the start of your event on climate justice, energy transition, green communities, which will happen during COP27. It's really important as we're preparing for COP27, the African COP, that you have, and we all have, a people-centered approach and are conscious of the injustices that lie behind the climate crisis. We know that most of the carbon emissions are caused historically and now by industrialized countries, and that large emerging economies like China, India, Russia are also contribute increasingly to the problem. But the worst impacts, as you know, are felt by the poorest countries and poorest communities who are least responsible. And we need to bear that in mind. We need to have a climate justice, people-centered approach. And I've identified about 5 layers of injustice that I just want to speak about briefly. The first is the one I've already been referencing, that the climate crisis has hit much earlier and much more severely the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples, who also, by and large, are the Black and brown and indigenous people of our world. So in that way, it's also a racial injustice. Secondly, there's the injustice that is gender injustice within that, because of the different social roles of women, often the lack of rights, even land rights, the lack of access to credit, the lack of being at the table for decision making. And yet it's women who have to build resilience in their communities, who have to go further for water or firewood during prolonged drought, or cope with flooding, cope with hurricanes, etc. That gender injustice has now been well understood, and yet we don't see money going to women on the ground as much as it should to build resilience. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice. And I don't need to say much about this, because young people, even school children with their Fridays for Future, have been calling us out and saying, don't load us with impossible problems. Take decisions now. We can't take them, but we're asking you to take your responsibility. And of course, we're not doing it enough. The fourth injustice is subtle, but it's important. Industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel. So we have a responsibility to acknowledge a debt, and to value the work of workers in coal and oil and gas, and in my country, peat, turf, and to care about their communities in a just transition, that there will be green jobs, that there will be training, that there will be pensioning off if necessary, but that there will be a real bringing with through a just transition out of those fossil fuels, a just transition into clean energy. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself, this awful loss of biodiversity, this terrible extinction of species, about which there was a report just a few days ago. A climate justice approach essentially is also an intergenerational approach. And I encourage you to be very intergenerational in your meeting. And so at COP27, it's important that G20 countries would step up with more ambitious NDCs, as they promised they would in Glasgow. Remember, the decision was taken. We will do it 1 year now. We'll do it at COP27, but they're not doing it. Very few have actually made their NDCs more ambitious. Secondly, we need to have more attention to another commitment in Glasgow, which was to double climate adaptation finance by 2025. There's no real roadmap for that. There's no real push for that at the moment. And it's a big increase in adaptation, which is so vital to countries, developing countries coming to COP27. And thirdly, and really importantly, we need to have a financing mechanism for loss and damage. We see now that the climate crisis is so severe, it goes beyond adaptation. Look at the terrible problems at the moment in Pakistan. A third of the country has been underwater. Farmers have lost everything. They've lost their fields, they've lost their animals, they've lost their homes. How can they adapt? They need targeted loss and damage, and we need a finance facility to do that. So I hope that these areas will be high on your agenda in talking about climate justice and just transition and green economies. And let me conclude by offering a more positive narrative about the climate crisis. I do worry sometimes that we speak about, and we should, about how dangerous a time we're in, how the window is closing, etc. We say all that, but actually people need a positive narrative. And I learned this from an indigenous woman called Jude Bico. She's based in New Mexico, and she has a saying in her tribe: what if our best times are still ahead of us? And they are. Our best times are still ahead of us when we've got rid of fossil fuel, because we will have cities that will be a joy to live in. We won't have the indoor and outdoor pollution. We'll have gardens, we'll have buildings that generate the energy, we'll have farms in cities themselves, but also we'll have countryside that rewilds. The 600 million people in Africa who never switched the switch for electricity will have distributed clean energy. And think what that will do for their families, particularly the women. We'll have a world that will be more equal, because clean energy will be available in distributed form all around the world. That is doable. That is part of the narrative. Why does it make such a difference? Because it empowers people. Because what we have to say is, yes, we are heading for our best times, but we're also heading for our worst times. We have a choice. What do we want to do? And yes, we don't have much time. So that's why we need a kind of moonshot mentality. And what we're saying as women leaders is, you know, John F. Kennedy put his man on the moon in 8 years. He said it was impossible at the time, and it was done. There are 7 years from January to 2030. And you know that we have to reduce by 45% at least carbon emissions. We have to restore biodiversity seriously. We have to protect our oceans. We have to, reduce the extinction, get back the species, etc. And all of that seems impossible, but we have to do it together in a climate justice movement, which gathers in all the elements, including the private sector, very importantly. And I believe that, you know, the Climate Reality Project has been going for a long time. It's got wonderful climate activists all over the world, including in Europe. I think we need your energy and your commitment to that. And let's remember a saying of Nelson Mandela. One of my chief responsibilities at the moment is I'm chair of the elders he brought together in 2007. I follow in heavy footsteps. The first chair was Archbishop Tutu. The second chair was Kofi Annan. And, you know, now I'm chair. And we often quote Mandela for lots of things, but I like his succinct way of putting it. It always seems impossible until it is done. And that is something to remember, that we have to do it. It always seems impossible. You couldn't put a man on the moon because there was no way. It happened. We can do this in the 7 years to 2030. And I rely very heavily on the Climate Reality Project and the Climate Reality Europe to push us and move us in the right direction. Thank you very much.
We can do it, and we don't have much time. Absolutely. Indeed, adapting to climate change is more than just a buzzword. It requires collective, holistic action and a paradigm shift from crisis response to ambitious and integrated approaches. Our next video is from the UK Climate Justice Coalition. As I'm sure many of you here know, that the issue of climate justice is at the core of what we do at the Climate Reality Project, as we recognize that a diverse and inclusive movement is critical to solving the climate crisis, and that to build that winning coalition, we must ensure that those directly impacted by it, particularly those that have been excluded from this, are at the center of movement for change.
For the Climate Justice Coalition. Previously, the COP26 Coalition, a group of around 200 organisations that came together during COP26 to protest, to learn, to build relationships, and wanted to continue working together. And the reason why we are called the Climate Justice Coalition is because we recognise that this crisis can't be solved without social justice at the heart of it. And that is particularly relevant as we enter talks in COP27, where loss and damages and reparations will be at the heart of the talks, because the justice element of climate is the lens that recognises that not everybody is equally contributing to the crisis and not everybody is being equally affected. We know that the richer nations are the worst emitters, and we know that the poorer nations, as we have seen in countless devastating natural disasters, especially in Pakistan, as we saw this year, how the poorer nations are at the sharper end of climate crisis. And so this year, we are taking to the streets, as you are watching this video, to push richer nations, especially the UK, to take responsibility for this crisis and pay the reparations and the money that is needed for these poorer nations to be able to adapt to the climate crisis. And not just because it is a moral obligation, but it is also a legal obligation. And it is our responsibility as civilians to hold our government's feet to the fire so that they pay these reparations. Hi there.
Wonderful. So we are now connecting live with Professor Jacqueline McGlade, who is in Egypt at the moment, live from COP27, despite her very busy schedule. Professor McGlade is a professor of natural prosperity, sustainable development and knowledge systems at University College London. She was the executive director of the European Environment Agency between 2003 and 2013. And she was also appointed chief scientist at the United Environment Agency Environment Program in early 2014. A very warm welcome to you, Jackie. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you. I know you're very busy, so we're going to get right into the questions. Jackie, I gather that you have been to many of the COP meetings. Can you tell us what is different about this one and whether you feel halfway through there is some progress?
I think one of the most striking things is that it's much quieter. There are no large demonstrations. Any of you who went to Glasgow last year will have remembered how vibrant the whole interaction was with people, so to speak, outside and inside. But there's nothing like that really here. There have been a few around climate justice, but I think for personal reasons and personal safety and the criticisms of lack of free speech, it's not as evident. Nevertheless, the big pieces, the juggernauts that we always see are here, which is, you know, reporting back. But it's the lack of progress. It's had a, for me, it's had a kind of dulling effect. And the fact that the biggest emitters are not talking to each other, and I'm talking about China and USA, is an issue. I mean, there's clearly a channel still for them to talk with each other, but there are clearly disagreements. So that's sort of in the background. The other question, of course, is from many delegates and many observers, is whether we're giving up, or the presidency is giving up on 1.5 degrees, and they're adamant that they're not, but they're giving space for people to discuss them. So there's less items, there's seriousness and urgency. There's a huge number of people registered, 46,000 people have registered, 28,000 are parties, 14,500 observers, lots of media, but 27,000 picked up their badges. So it's a kind of interesting dynamic about who's here and who's coming next week and so on. But at the core of it, it's what we have expected. So the major issues are around finance, of course, still around transforming our energy system, transport, but the overshadowing issue is the impact of extreme events. As Mary Robertson said, it's happening much more quickly than we ever imagined. And I think the size of the gap is what's sort of changing the dynamic in this COP, because clearly it's about finance and it's about urgency, it's about food security, it's overshadowing everything. And that's why I think a lot of people have been pleased to see loss and damages on the table and adaptation. But it's all about the modalities. So it's as much about the size of the money that we need and the amounts as to how it's going to be used. There is one thing I think that's worth saying, is that there was a lot of criticism in the last days, particularly yesterday, on decarbonisation around the fossil fuel companies who are here. I took some time to have a look at it, and it's quite interesting because the sessions are all about accountability. And the criticism about them being here, I think, is slightly swayed because of people getting very emotional. Essentially, they have to be here, but they were here to be accountable. I mean, they couldn't be here unless they'd already had a track record, and they had to show where they're heading. But in the end, it's the 298 parties who are going to be making those decisions. So I would say it's sort of more somber, more kind of getting down to it. But there is progress, but it is quiet and it's a lot slower in some places than we would have hoped.
I hope we see some practical changes in the next few days. Jackie, many people have called COP27 the African COP. Do you feel if this has made any difference to the negotiations so far? And are the African nations now leading this and are playing a great role because of it?
Well, don't forget that this is one of the very few instances where every country gets a vote, you know, like literally everybody is equal. But what I do know is that a lot of my colleagues across Africa have been able to get here, which is fantastic. They have their voice, they're in the room. What I really appreciate is, you may not call it an African COP in the sense of the substance, but what I'm seeing so much is how many solutions are coming from Africa, from within Africa. And there's a greater emphasis on gender because, of course, women's issues here are very obvious and very apparent. So certain items on agendas are being discussed more explicitly. What I love, of course, is that the diversity of food systems in Africa is making its way in. So we talk about transforming food systems. For example, there was a launch of the Beans Are How campaign. And of course, you're in the continent where beans are absolutely amazing. They're staple, people eat them for breakfast, lunch and dinner. So there's a lot more recognition of how much people can bring that sort of African agenda into the everyday discussions about how people are negotiating. There's certainly a good grasp by a lot of my African colleagues here about what is needed. But I think genuinely, the bottom line of all of this is that the just transitions that we're looking for, they're not going to be solved by holding back on NDCs, that's for sure. But there is no single cookie cutter. I'm hoping that people being here in Africa and meeting so many ideas and people with solutions realize that there's no one single cookie cutter. It's just not reasonable to think that carbon capture and sequestration is an answer. There's so many other things we have to do. But diplomatically, we just come back to hosting meetings. It's clear that we need to have meetings like this in the developing world, no question about it. And there's a strong solution emphasis everywhere coming from a local level. But it's going to change because there's the talk now that in the future, in the coming future, there's going to be a potential COP between Australia and the Pacific Islands. Well, that's going to be a completely different thing than trying to all be in one place at one time. So I'm hoping that what this one has done is opened up the creativity of how we can host meetings where many people can have their voices and actually have the experience of bringing their view into it. And I think that's what this COP has done. I think it's opened it up to many, many more people from the developing world.
And I do believe it is crucial to have those most affected by climate change to be present. And for that, I think this has given the opportunity to many African countries to be able to participate. Jackie, adaptation has always been gotten into mitigation at the COP meetings, and it was supposed to be one of the key focuses of COP27. Can you let us know if that has happened and whether there has been some progress in that area?
So I've actually been following the negotiations and the texts around adaptation. There is progress. It's not clear necessarily in large announcements or the press meetings each day, but it's certainly happening. Maybe not as rapidly as others have thought. But I think, unfortunately, what I see, and this is kind of personal observation, is that sometimes people get really caught up in the detail of adaptation, so much so that they kind of lose the big picture. And when I think about the negotiations today, compared to even 3 or 4 years ago, I mean, we're looking at a very, very different situation. I mean, the cost of the disasters in Pakistan, third of the country underwater, it looks like ocean, 300 kilometers from the shoreline, is going to be in the order of $30 billion. That's one event. We have been spending $31 billion per year. I mean, so what does that mean for development funding? What it means is that in adaptation time, we can't imagine that nations are going to be able to fund this on their own through the national sort of treasury and aid. So I think this is beginning to really come home to people's way of thinking. And then that immediately comes over to the effect of loss and damage. Loss and damage is now in the agenda, but I think the whole balance of what we consider to be development, what we consider to be adaptation, will very quickly start to merge into one. And then we need to talk about modalities and understand, do we have mechanisms that can actually distribute funds properly, or do we need new mechanisms? And how on earth, even if we were to have all the funds that we need, how can we make sure that it is distributed fairly and respecting, obviously, national borders? How can we make sure that the neediest in the world, the poorest in the world, the most impacted, actually get the support that they need? So slow progress, but I'm pretty sure that by the time we get into the middle of next week, that we'll begin to see the adaptation will get some feet, will get some grounding, and it will turn to be one of the main focuses and outcomes of this week.
And of course, this brings me to my last question. This has got everything to do with the climate finance. And I hate to quote Tom Cruise, but this COP is about show me the money. With the missing $100 billion and loss of damage being top of the agendas, how have the negotiations gone? And do you think we will get the agreement on climate finance this time? We've been fighting for this for so many years.
I think if you were to talk to representatives from the LDCs, the least developed countries, they are still struggling with the idea that there's no guarantees that the funds for loss and damages have been properly understood. And there's a kind of split between those who want to see a completely new facility and those who are saying, well, we've got enough mechanisms, now it's a matter of how do we get the funds into it. There is no doubt that loss and damages will be there. The challenge is going to be on the timing. Of course, these developed countries and others need something in writing and coming out of here maybe by 2024. But I think that's going to be too big a challenge for some of the countries, even for the EU. Nevertheless, some countries like Scotland and Denmark and Germany and even a province within Belgium have put money on the table. And that's very, very encouraging. It's a sense of solidarity that's coming through, which is incredibly important. I've been attending some of the private finance discussions with private investors and with a whole raft of people who are really committed to making sure that loss and damage isn't just about taking the proper money, but actually making sure that the right money goes to the right places. And I think that's where we need much greater clarity about future impacts, current impacts, and how we're going to build this into adaptation. So just to give you sort of an idea, some of the schools that were built in Pakistan through aid funds that were actually designed to be disaster-proof. As the disaster hit, those schools were still standing. What that meant was they were built 10, 15 years ago. What that meant is that those schools would have to be rebuilt. And so the more we think about going forward and creating essentially infrastructure and ways for people to survive, then we're going to actually start to attenuate some of those loss and damage from the places. But it's going to require a complete turnaround in the way that we think about helping each other as we go forward. So no simple answers. I'm encouraged by the way that a lot of industry and a lot of financial institutions are seeing this as an important role they have to play. And I believe that over the next few days, there will be some fairly significant steps in that direction. We just have to make sure as civil society and academics and researchers that that is done ethically and in a way that is just to those who actually require the support and where they need the loss and damage to have an impact.
Jackie, thank you so much for making time to be with us. I know you're very busy. Best of luck with everything and the remaining days at COP27. Thank you again for joining us, Professor Jackie McGlade.
Thank you so much.